Okay, I'm going to talk about question 8. It's talked about the function defined by 2 cos to the minus 1 x minus 1, write down the domain and range. We've got to realise that cos to the minus 1 is talking about arc cos. So we've got to now think about arc cos and how arc cos is created. So arc cos comes from the cosine graph. So if I sketch the cosine graph in here, pretty bad sketch, but that'll do. We've got 1 and minus 1 is the range. Now remember, that's the outputs. The inputs go from 0, and we end up having to restrict our domain to pi because we want it to be a one-to-one function so that we can do the inverse of cos and find arc cos. Now that means that when we're writing down the domain and range of this function, because this is an inverse function, we're looking at arc cos of this bit, the domain becomes the range and the range becomes the domain, which means that right now the domain is 0 to pi. We'll come back to that, and that becomes the range. The range, which is 1 to minus 1, becomes the domain. So we can straight away say, well, the domain is equal, or the domain is minus 1 to x to 1. Now the range, as I said before, the domain becomes a range, the range becomes a domain. Right now the domain is 0 to pi, and that becomes the range. So we normally expect it just between 0 and pi. But because we are multiplying this by 2, because it's getting stretched and it's also shifting the graph down 1, then what we've got to do is we've got to affect the range. So we've got to do 2 times by nothing is nothing, take away 1. So the range becomes minus 1 of the function, and we are going to have to do 2 times by pi, which is 2 pi, take away 1. So it becomes 2 pi, take away 1. Find the exact value of f to the minus 0.5. So for this one, we need to put into our calculator 0.5. Now, a lot of you end up working in degrees. Remember, because this is arc cos, it needs to be done in radians. So we just need to put into our calculators cos of the negative 0.5, or cos of the negative 1 of negative 0.5, and we end up getting an answer of 2 pi upon 3, which means overall we end up with 2 times by 2 pi upon 3, take away 1, which gives us a final answer of 4 pi over 3, take away 1. And then finally, for the inverse function, a lot of you realise that we need to get y is equal to x, and x becomes y for the inverse function. So if I rewrite this as x equals 2 cos to the minus 1 of y minus 1, we add 1 to both sides, so we get x plus 1 equals 2 cos to the minus 1 y. Divides both sides by 2, we get x plus 1 over 2 equals cos to the negative 1 y. We now need to get rid of this arc cos. So to get rid of an arc cos, we've got to cos both sides. So we end up with cos, open bracket, x plus 1 over 2 equals y.